first time you play somewhere, people don't know what to expect from a band, and when we come out and just start talking about really stupid sexual things, sometimes it throws people off, but I think once people understand that where we're coming from is a joke and it's all in good fun, then they get it more.
The first wave of punk broke in 1976 with the arrival of the Sex Pistols. For the first time since the mid-60s, British music was once again the talk of the world. Punk rock would soon become a lucrative business, with bands such as The Damned and The Clash proving to be successful money spinners. Even though the British punk acts all claimed to be influenced by American bands such as Iggy and the Stooges, the MC5 and the New York Dolls, it would be 4 or 5 years before the United States caught on and produced their own brand of punk. However, by the early 80s it became obvious that American punk was becoming incredibly popular. Bratty cartoon rockers the Ramones were building up a large following, and the intense sound of the New York hardcore bands like the Germs was taking over the underground scene. The floodgates were finally opened 10 years later, as the South California scene exploded. Suddenly, American punk was big business on both sides of the Atlantic. Green Day, Rancid and The Offspring were capable of scoring hit singles and producing high-selling albums, easily competing with the pop bands of the time. These new punk bands differed from the original British acts in many ways, but the most significant change was the addition of a large dose of humour. Smash hits like Green Day's Basket Case and later on The Offspring's Pretty Fly for a White Guy were less about politics and more about poking fun. Serious, angry bands still existed, and some bands, The Offspring in particular, combined both humour and heavy messages. Others chose to devote themselves to the lighter side of punk, focusing on having a good time, in the same way that early US groups like the Ramones and the Replacements had done. One such band was Blink-182. Hidden for a long time by bands more successful than themselves, Blink-182 have made an art form out of schoolboy humour. Completely unconcerned with the deeper issues of life, their songs have a playful charm that has recently won legions of followers across the world. Always a popular underground band, their sense of humour has remained untouched by years of touring and near obscurity. In fact, it would be easy to think that they just emerged from high school and become an overnight success. But it's unlikely any bunch of teenagers could produce songs as catchy and well-constructed as Blink-182 do. Their road to fame had simple beginnings. 3 teenagers that really didn't want to get a proper job.
Poway, San Diego, yeah. Poway's a suburb of San Diego. Riverside's about like an hour away, but we all kind of grew up in the same scene in California. You know, skating, snowboarding, whatever. Just grew up little skate rats.
The Blink-182 story begins in 1991, in a small town near San Diego, California. In the early 90s, there was a growing punk scene in San Diego, although it was overshadowed by the bands from Orange County, home of The Offspring, The Vandals and Lit. Even so, there was enough happening to keep 3 young men happy. Few of the San Diego groups would go on to emulate the success of Blink-182. But for now, the ska punk of the local clubs and bars was the most important thing in the world. The first of the trio was Thomas Matthew DeLong. Tom was born on December 13th, 1975, in Poway, San Diego. His family were middle class and quietly religious, although not extreme in their beliefs. Tom went to church every Sunday, but his religious obligations were not strict. Despite his relatively stable background, he was a problematic child. Tom had discovered alcohol at an early age, and had indulged himself very heavily indeed. Expelled from school before his 15th birthday for drinking at a basketball game, Tom spent his time annoying shopkeepers and dodging the police. Also a keen skater, the errant teenager spent many hours shooting through local malls, knocking over as many shelves and racks as possible before disappearing, leaving the frustrated security guards behind. At school, Tom had been a less than perfect student, but there was one thing he applied himself to: the guitar. He'd first become interested in the instrument on a church camping trip. One of the other campers had brought a guitar along, and Tom spent more time on his bed playing the borrowed guitar than he did joining in the camping activities. Upon his return home, he quickly found himself a cheap guitar and soon mastered the basics. Possessing a good singing voice, he often accompanied his own songs, but so far he hadn't thought about the prospect of forming or playing in a band. When Tom was 16, he came the closest to respectability he ever would. Despite continuing his skateboard antics, he had also secured himself a job. It wasn't much, just loading bags of cement onto trucks at a construction materials warehouse. Not the most exciting job ever, but it gave the young Tom enough money to pursue his three loves: skateboarding, parties, and punk rock. Tom had discovered punk on holiday in Oregon when he'd gone to visit a friend. This friend was heavily into punk and introduced Tom to such bands as Stiff Little Fingers, Dinosaur Jr. and The Descendants. Despite having previously thought punk was nothing but fast noise, Tom fell in love with the sounds he heard. The next link in the chain was a young man named Mark Allen Hoppus, who had turned 19 a few months before. Mark came from a well-off family, and his father worked as a high-tech weapons engineer for the US Navy, helping to design computer systems for some of the most advanced weaponry of the day. Mark had been born in California, although his father's work took the family to various places in the US, rarely staying anywhere for longer than 2 years. Since then, Mark had said that the constant moving from place to place was the only consistent feature of his childhood. His parents divorced when he was 14, and Mark went to live with his father, Tex, in Washington, D.C. When Mark was 16, he returned to California and settled in the town of Ridgecrest near San Diego. The town is situated near a missile test site where his father worked. The move back to the Sunshine State wasn't a problem for Mark, who'd already discovered the joys of the SoCal, or South Californian punk scene. His favourite band was The Descendants, who would prove to be a great influence on Blink-182 in later years. A look at The Descendants' discography reveals obvious similarities to Mark's later band. Songs like Milo Goes to College, I Don't Want to Go to College, and Everything Sucks could be straight off any Blink-182 record. Both bands have the same attitude, a defiant stand against anyone who might call them losers or expect them to be in any way serious. Like many teenagers, Mark admired the Sex Pistols, but found their anarchic stance a little too much for him. The songs were great, but he wasn't interested in taking on the establishment. At the same time as being exposed to punk, Mark had also discovered parties and girls. Aside from music, these two were the most important things in his life. It's only natural that Mark should be more interested in songs about the pleasures of life than in political ideas. Mark's musical development began when he was 14. In return for his help painting a house, Tex Hoppus bought Mark a bass guitar and amplifier. Before long, Mark had begun teaching himself to play simple tunes, working out the bass lines to the Descendants' songs first. Eventually, he would move on to more complicated material such as The Cure and The Replacements. Like Tom, he was also a keen skateboarder and spent much of his free time riding his board throughout the town. By coincidence, Tom was one of the first people that Mark met on his arrival in the new town. Mark had vague ambitions to be a high school English teacher, so he'd enrolled at a local college. Lurking outside the college with his skateboarding friends was Tom. The pair talked about boarding for a while, and it became obvious that they had much in common, including the same kind of juvenile sense of humour. They were soon good friends, and often talked about the idea of forming a band. A couple of garage rehearsals made them even more keen, and before long, Mark and Tom were writing their own simple tunes and performing for whoever would listen.
San Diego has a very huge music scene, especially for local bands and local talent, and we're actually, honestly, really lucky to have come from San Diego because we've gotten, we wouldn't have had the support that we had from the beginning, coming from a different city.
As Blink moved on to clubs and bars, their shows became considerably more extravagant. Not content just to play music, they developed a series of audience participation routines, which suited their sense of humour. The most popular of these were the wet t-shirt contests, where members of the audience were invited to douse themselves with water and dance in front of the stage. Not wishing to be seen as sexist, the band also suggested that the men change into skimpy shorts and soak themselves too. Before long, Blink concerts were beginning to resemble strip shows as dedicated fans got carried away and dispensed with the t-shirts entirely. This wasn't as much of a problem as it might seem. For a start, some of Blink's shows were at strip clubs anyway, where such behaviour wasn't exactly a surprise. Other venue owners turned a blind eye. A number of their customers might be half naked and soaked, but everyone was spending money, and a Blink concert was soon guaranteed to be sold out. The band themselves had no problems with the audience having a good time. and it wasn't long before they were actively encouraging women to get rid of their tops. Understandably, these antics won the band a fair amount of attention in the local area. Many people were intrigued by these three kids whose shows were more like water-soaked beach parties than anything else. For years they would be known as teenagers, long after Mark and Tom had passed the age of 19. Mark had in fact turned 20, just 6 months after the band had started, but something about their juvenile humour and behaviour made them appear to be eternal adolescents. By now, Blink had saved enough money to record a handful of songs. They hired a 4-track recorder and selected the best tracks from their live show. This release would be cassette only and contain 4 songs. Unfortunately, they weren't particularly experienced in the art of recording, and the Fly Swatter EP is far from their best. Although these days copies of the EP are valued as collector's items, the recordings don't stand up well against their later work, and Mark and Tom are quite willing to admit that the EP is one of the worst things they've ever done. Fly Swatter was sold at their shows and through their mail order system, but it didn't prove particularly popular. Blink were known primarily as a live band, and it would be a while before their recorded work achieved the same popularity as their shows. Blink also gained a good deal of respect from their peers in the punk rock field. Although the more serious-minded bands were disparaging about their attitude, the surf skate groups thought Blink were a very good thing indeed. Many of them had also grown up on a diet of the Descendants and the Ramones, and loved girls and the good life just as much as Mark, Tom and Scott did. Most of their support came from Orange County punks, the Vandals. Although they never quite made it into the same league as Green Day and The Offspring, they were a highly respected outfit, mostly because they survived without a major label support. Drummer Josh Freese had also involved himself in many side projects, including the annual Devo reunion tours, Tool frontman Maynard Keenan's new band A Perfect Circle, and most importantly, the new Guns N' Roses album, The Chinese Democracy. Josh and the Vandals were keen fans of Blink, and helped them out in a variety of ways. The Vandals ran their own independent label called Kung Fu Records. This was mainly to allow them to release their own albums, but occasionally other bands would be invited to record and put out something on their label. Being friends with the Vandals, it was no problem for Blink to arrange to release their next recording through Kung Fu Records. The process was relatively quick. Blink already had the songs prepared, as they'd been playing them live for some time now. Eventually, 14 songs were recorded for the album, which would be called Buddha. Once again, the album would be only available as a cassette, although in later years it would be reissued as a CD. By the end of 1994, the boys were ready to release Buddha. As a debut album, it's not as bad as it could be. Blink-182's later style is very much in evidence. Fast-paced songs with melodic hooks, showcasing Tom's irreverent lyrics. The best tracks are My Pet Sally and TV, although most of the songs are of a high standard. There are 1 or 2 weak cuts, but mostly it's an impressive collection. Blink had a good recording under their belt, and were now in a position to move on to much bigger and better things.
It was an Irish techno band called Blink. They just said they would sue us if we didn't change our name, and so we did.
With their musical career progressing smoothly and relatively quickly, the band were forced to look to other affairs for a while. Scott had been living in Reno, Nevada for the past year or so, but it was now necessary for him to move closer to Southern California. The band was far too busy for him to be so far away, even though he had his own transport. By the middle of 1994, Scott had moved in with Mark in Poway, San Diego. Scott was continuing his high school education by post, since he was keen to go to college in a couple of years. The band would joke with interviewers that Scott would be doing his homework in between songs when they played live. The truth was a little more serious. Scott had always maintained that he loved making music, but also that he didn't want that to be the only thing he could do. For the moment, things were fine, but it wasn't long before Scott's desire to keep up his academic achievements became a serious problem for the band. Mark himself wasn't doing so well with his studies. Despite having received good grades for 3 years, he was told by the college authorities that he hadn't actually fulfilled any of the requirements for any specific course. He'd simply taken courses that appeared interesting, not realising that if he'd continued doing that, he wouldn't be allowed to progress onto the final year of his degree. Faced with the knowledge that he'd have to study for another 2 years, Mark decided it would be wiser to devote himself to Blink. He was still working at the record store, and he had money coming from the band, so he could still support himself. Tom continued to work at the construction store, delivering materials to building sites. Blink's fame continued to grow. They were playing 3 or 4 gigs a week and were taking short tours around the country, sometimes as far afield as the East Coast. As an independent release, Buddha was selling well, although not enough to break into the charts. The cassette-only format made it inappropriate for radio play, but it was still a good representation of the band and proved popular at concerts. It also attracted the attention of other independent labels, who expressed a desire to sign Blink. One of these, Cargo Records, wanted to sign the band for 1 album, after which the contract could be renegotiated. This was precisely what the band wanted. They had a chance to record a better album, but without being tied to the label in case things didn't work out. As it happened, this was a wise move on their part, as it wasn't long before they were being approached by major labels. For now, they were happy to sign with Cargo Records. The resulting album would be released through their Grilled Cheese imprint, a subsection of Cargo. Sessions for the new record were once again quick and easy, mostly because 7 of the 16 tracks of the album were re-recorded versions of songs that had appeared on Buddha. The remaining 9 were drawn from the past 3 years, so some of the material was quite old. Unfortunately, it showed. Cheshire Cat, named by Tom because of his love of Alice in Wonderland, was definitely inferior to the previous release. Songs like Does My Breath Smell were still good live numbers, but they didn't come across particularly well on disc. It didn't help that some of the tracks taken from Buddha weren't the best ones on that album. The production was dull and lacklustre, sometimes sounding as if the band were playing in the next room instead of having the loud, in-your-face appeal of the live shows. Lyrically, the album dealt with the same themes as before. Carousel and Does My Breath Smell described failed attempts to impress girls, whilst Toast and Bananas was dedicated to the art of laziness. Occasionally there were moments of surprising depth. Cacophony and Sometimes, 2 of the album's standout tracks, told tales of alienation, despair and self-doubt. Only one thing interrupted the release of Blink's second full-length album. As the sessions were nearing completion, it was discovered that there was already a band with the name Blink. The other band was Irish and already had a record contract. They weren't famous, but there was no doubt who would lose out if it came to a legal battle. The Irish Blink had been around for a few years longer than their American counterparts, so it was decided that Mark, Tom and Scott would have to change the name of their band. The change was a simple one. 3 numbers would be added to the existing name, making it Blink-182. Despite many attempts to analyse the meaning behind those numbers, there really is none. They just seemed the best idea at the time. However, Tom and Mark have had lots of fun making up quack theories about the change. For a while, they claimed the name was taken from the title of the flop 1985 movie Turk 182, but they have since denied this, pointing out that the movie is too dumb to take your name from. Another amusing theory they've used is the numbers 1, 8 and 2 add up to 11, the number that the amplifier goes up to in the spoof rockumentary This Is Spinal Tap. Cheshire Cat was released in early 1995, and the band began a lengthy series of shows in support of the album. The tradition of wet t-shirt contests and half-naked females was by now firmly established, even though their audience was largely made up of kids under the age of 16. During the autumn of 1995, they toured with Pennywise, another Californian punk band with a large and loyal following. These shows were Blink-182's largest so far, and they went well. Pennywise loved their stage antics, and soon became firm friends with Mark, Tom and Scott. The year ended well for the band. With the new name in place, things were beginning to move very quickly. After 4 years of work, they had reached the point of no return. Blink-182 were becoming the ones to watch, and the next 18 months would see them on the verge of stardom.
When we were recording Dude Ranch, I was in the studio saying my biggest goal for this record is to sell 200,000 copies. I wish that we can sell 200,000 copies. We're at 7 now, 700,000. So it's just blown us away.
Despite touring constantly for the last months of 1995, the band didn't take a break when 1996 rolled around. After a number of their own shows, Blink-182 signed up for the Warped Tour, the punk rock equivalent of the summer package tours. Although the summer tours such as the Lollapalooza were confirmed money spinners, the Warped Tour usually only made enough money to clear its expenses. Even so, it was still a well-attended event, and the only one of its kind. Punk acts were sometimes included in the other summer tours, but rarely as one of the headlining acts. The previous year had seen Green Day's Dookie album outselling all expectations, increasing media interest in the new wave of punk rock acts. The Warped Tour benefited from this attention, and would soon be a very high-profile event, with the Vandals, The Offspring, Lit and Blink-182 being regulars on the annual trek. This was also the first chance for Blink-182 to embark on a proper world tour. In the company of Pennywise and No Effects, they travelled across the United States and Canada, with a handful of shows in Japan, Australia, and a one-off performance in Hawaii. Although the band weren't aware of it, Australia would very soon become their favourite place to tour. Blink-182 were very quickly becoming heroes in the land down under, and their albums would be selling well there long before the rest of the world caught on. Meanwhile, they released a second EP, Wasting Time, on the independent Rapido label. There was no new material on the EP, just tracks taken from the Cheshire Cat album. Blink-182's music was also featured on a number of sports videos. Director Taylor Steele found their brand of punk to be perfect for skateboarding, snowboarding and surfing scenes. So a number of the band's songs appeared as the backing tracks to his high-energy videos. A substantial number of their fans were skaters and surfers, so the videos were aimed pretty much directly at their target audience. Steele's videos were shown on cable TV and sold across the world, so Blink-182 were given extra exposure. Despite their reputation as fun-loving layabouts, the band actually worked very hard. They have never been too fond of proper rehearsals, but during 1996 and 97, their gig schedule was very heavy indeed. At the end of the Warped Tour, Blink-182 began making plans to record their third full-length album, which would also be released on the Cargo label. This time round, the sessions did benefit from a more structured approach. Rather than simply bashing out the songs as quickly as possible, several takes were done, with a number of overdubs fleshing out the sound. The results were by far their best yet, a considerable step up from Cheshire Cat. The 15 tracks on Dude Ranch, as it would be known, were all the same adrenaline-fueled pop-punk as before, but with some moments of outstanding quality. Mark considers Apple Shampoo to be his best songwriting ever, and it's one of the finest tracks on the album. I'm Sorry and Josie are the traditional songs dedicated to trying to get a girl, and the latter sparked off a certain amount of debate as to who the real Josie might be. According to the band, there isn't one, and Josie is the name of a neighbour's dog. Mind you, Blink were also supposed to be the name of a neighbour's dog, according to Tom. Occasionally, the juvenile humour on the album wears a little thin, with Dick Lips being one of their most annoying songs to date. However, these more tasteless moments are kept to a minimum, and for the most part, Dude Ranch is a highly polished and professional-sounding album. Released in June 1997, the new album was an immediate success by the band's previous standards. Alternative radio stations pounced on Dude Ranch, quickly singling out the third song, Damn It, as a potential radio hit. And indeed it was. Within 3 months, around 50 radio stations had added Damn It to their playlists. The song soon became Blink-182's first hit single, climbing into the lower reaches of the Billboard Modern Rock chart. Australia responded particularly well to the new album. Blink-182 were now becoming incredibly popular there, with Dude Ranch reaching number 35 in the album charts and spending nearly 5 months in the top 100. The first festival appearance of that year was to be in Australia, at the Equinox Spring Festival. Blink-182 were in prestigious company, with Australian heroes Midnight Oil headlining. US metalers Tool and Brit rock outfits Skunk Anansie were ahead of them on the bill. But Mark, Tom and Scott delivered their hour-long set with energy and good humour, once again requesting that the 10,000-strong crowd get rid of as much clothing as possible. With Australia successfully conquered, it was really only a matter of time before the rest of the world followed suit. Blink-182 were now on the verge of worldwide success, but there would be some important changes before they achieved all they hoped for.
As far as headlining goes, yeah, probably. I mean, we did the Warped Tour, and we did Snowcore where the venues were huge or whatever, but as far as headlining our own shows go, this has definitely been a step up for us.
The next major engagement for Blink-182 was once again the Warped Tour. Since last year, the tour had become sponsored by one of the largest manufacturers of skateboards in the United States, and was now called the Vans Warped Tour. This time around would be the biggest Warped Tour yet, with many high-profile bands appearing such as Pennywise, Old Friends the Vandals, 311, the Mighty Mighty Bosstones and, of course, Blink-182. With Dude Ranch still selling well, the Australian leg of the tour turned out to be the band's personal favourite. When they played in Melbourne, Blink-182 were given such a warm welcome that they resolved to return to the city as often as possible. They would frequently point out to audiences that Melbourne was their favourite city, which perhaps understandably didn't always go down too well, especially when they weren't actually playing in Melbourne that night. Occasionally things didn't go too smoothly in Australia. One performance, headlined by Blink-182 and supported by 3 Australian punk acts, descended into rioting as police tried to break up the mosh pit rather than allowing the teenagers to thrash about on their own. Unused to dealing with security at concerts, the police overreacted, causing bad feeling amongst the crowd. They responded by throwing everything they could get their hands on at the stage, where Blink-182 were halfway through their set. The show had to be cancelled as the band was taken off to a secure area and the crowd was broken up. Scott, speaking for the band, said they would have no problem returning to the venue at a later date and that the police were not to blame. They hadn't been adequately briefed or trained for the event and reacted in the best interests of the audience. Thankfully, there were no more incidents of this kind on the rest of the tour. It was primarily their reception in Australia that attracted the attention of the major labels. Realising that Blink-182 would soon be very popular indeed, they were keen to sign the band to their label. Interscope, whose acts included Bush and rapper Dr. Dre, made a promising offer, but the best one came from MCA, a long-established label with a very successful history. So Tom, Mark and Scott chose to accept their offer and were signed to a major label 6 years after forming the band. While the band was signing the deal with MCA and working out the terms, Dude Ranch continued to do well, and eventually sold 500,000 copies by the end of 1997. After signing with MCA, they took over the distribution, using their superior resources to push the album even further. In Australia, it would soon break the 1 million copies mark, earning Blink-182 the kind of money they had only dreamt of before. Their earlier albums had made a little profit, but much of that had to be pumped back into extensive touring and new equipment. With MCA behind them, Blink-182 could afford new apartments and many luxury items. Mark and Tom finally quit their jobs. They'd only been working when they were back in San Diego, but had retained their jobs as a safety net. Now the time had come to dedicate themselves 100% to the band, and they finally had the money to do so. At least that is the way Tom and Mark saw it. Scott disagreed. In his eyes, it was important to keep up his studies and learn a trade other than music. With the MCA deal, the band were playing in the big leagues, but Scott still insisted college was important and refused to put the band first. The matter was put aside for the time being, although it was obvious that this situation could not continue for much longer. Something would have to be done, one way or another. Meanwhile, Blink-182 were set to perform their first headlining tour. They were to be around-the-world treks, focusing on Australia and the United States, but also heading to Europe, Japan and Canada for short periods. This tour would charmingly be called the Poo Poo Pee Pee Tour, and would feature the usual mix of juvenile antics and childish behaviour, but on a much larger scale, seeing as this was their first time headlining. The support acts were Unwritten Law and Homegrown, 2 skate punk bands from San Diego, long-standing friends of Mark and Tom. This tour was also the first time that Blink-182 had made heavy use of sponsorship. But before long, virtually everything they used or wore would be the result of a deal with the manufacturing company. Sunglasses, t-shirts, even boxer shorts, everything. In later years, they would become known as the kings of sponsorship deals, and to some people this would seem excessively commercial. But for Blink-182, sponsorship deals means only one thing: more money. It didn't alter the quality or spirit of the music.
Tours like the Warped Tour are so much fun because you get to see all these bands and they're so good, like the people that run the Warped Tour are awesome. All the other bands are totally cool, nobody has an attitude or whatever, but you only get to play for half an hour. And the Warped Tour is also awesome because you get to see so many bands in a day that you get exposed to whatever on this year. You get your swing, you get your ska, you get punk rock, you get all kinds of music.
The first commitment of 1998 was another lengthy trek around the world, this time in the company of a band called Less Than Jake. Once again, the Blink-182 schoolboy humour came through, with the tour being known as the Race Around Uranus. This time they spent even longer on the road, once again staying in Australia and the United States for the longest. This extended trip brought relations with Scott to a head. With their tours getting longer and longer each time, Scott was beginning to have doubts about his ability to keep up his academic studies. He told the band this, and suggested they take a sabbatical from band activities in order to allow him to catch up with his work. Mark and Tom were not impressed. They hadn't worked hard for nearly 7 years to give up at the moment of their greatest success. They saw Scott's reluctance to commit to the band as something of a betrayal, and informed him that if he wasn't prepared to keep up with the rest of them, then he should leave the band. This was more of a dismissal than a choice, and Scott Rayner was thrown out of Blink-182. This was a major upset. Scott had been in the band as long as Mark and Tom, and it was assumed that the three of them would always be together. Unfortunately, the recent troubles had shown this to be impractical. Even though Mark and Tom weren't happy about dismissing Scott, they weren't about to let it get in the way of Blink-182's continuing success. They had come so far. It didn't make sense to stop now. The main priority now was to enroll a replacement drummer. Thankfully, a suitable candidate was quickly found, someone they already knew. Travis Landon Barker was 22 years old at this point, and a native of California. Having grown up in the rougher district of Riverside, California, Travis had used drumming as his way to avoid a life of crime. His mother had always been supportive of his musical leanings. She had died when he was 10, but not before telling him to follow his desire to be a musician. He was a skilled drummer with a love of punk, especially the Descendants, but he also had a fondness for the Police and jazz rock band Steely Dan. Before joining Blink-182, Travis had earned an impressive series of credentials, playing in respected ska punk bands like the Suicide Machines and the Aquabats. For a while, he'd been drummer for the Vandals, which is where he first met Mark and Tom. He'd recently left the Aquabats, so the offer to join Blink-182 came just at the right time. The band didn't head straight out onto the road after recruiting Travis. Mark was busy making arrangements to manage a fledgling punk band from San Diego called River Phoenix. His aim was to allow them the opportunities Blink-182 never had. Frequently, bands learn the right way to do things, but only when it's too late to change. Mark hoped to ensure that River Phoenix made the right choices first time round. Travis took the opportunity to begin his own company, called Stars and Straps, Belts and Belt Buckles. The company specialised in hot rod designs from the 50s, and the Blink-182 connection brought a great deal of attention to Travis's business venture. Meanwhile, Damn It continued to be the group's anthem. The song was chosen for the soundtrack to the hit romantic comedy Can't Hardly Wait. The teen angst sentiments of the track fitted in with the theme of the movie and brought Blink-182's music to an even larger audience. Before long, the band would find that many of their fans only knew Damn It and were unaware of their previous history. They were glad to be attracting new fans, but were slightly annoyed when people assumed Blink-182 were a new band. The next project was the recording of their major label debut. With the full complement of studio resources available to them, as well as the services of a professional producer, Blink-182 were in a position to record their best album so far. With the backing of MCA, this could be their chance to really hit the big time.
And I model a lot of enemas. I model enema bags. I model enema bags. And today we're modeling one for the album cover because we might call it Enema of the State. That's really good. That was really good, huh? Hey, that's a good. Hey, where's Mark? Hey, Mark, let's name the album Enema of the State.
Blink-182's fourth album and their first for MCA was released in June 1999. Tom came up with the title Enema of the State. It was, without a shadow of a doubt, their best effort so far, and one of the finest albums of the year. Despite the typically juvenile title, the songs showed definite signs of maturity. Blink-182 hadn't turned into philosophers overnight, but they had altered their lyrics to fit their age. Many of the tracks are concerned with the idea that life is just as confusing and annoying after college as it is at high school. It's just as difficult to be an adult as it is to be a teenager. And girls are still notoriously hard to understand. Lead-off single What's My Age Again dealt with the problems of being expected to be mature and grown up, but still feeling the urge to act like you're 18. It was accompanied by a humorous video featuring Tom, Mark and Travis running naked through a town before catching up with a girl in a nurse's uniform. The girl was in fact porn star Janine, who also graced the cover of the album, sporting the same nurse's uniform and a blue latex glove. One track, Going Away to College, had the narrator wondering if his girl at home still remembered him. Other songs were even more downbeat. Adam's song contained thoughts of suicide and self-doubt, but thankfully ended on a positive note. This idea of hope at the end of the tunnel was a recurring theme on the album, with many songs suggesting that things will get better. Musically, the album consisted of the same fast-paced melodic punk, but was more intricate than earlier attempts. Tom's guitar playing had matured considerably, with moments of subtlety and restraint, as opposed to the all-out riffing of the last few albums. This new subtle feel contrasted well against the adrenaline and passion of the choruses. All in all, it was a perfect mix. Blink-182's sound had finally evolved into something truly original. What's My Age Again was given fairly heavy rotation on MTV, with the video proving a favourite of the viewers. Even so, sales of the single remained relatively low. Enema of the State was slowly climbing the charts, receiving good airplay, but it was still not enough to compete with established bands like Limp Bizkit and the Red Hot Chili Peppers, whose latest albums were selling phenomenally well. However, Blink-182 found themselves steadily becoming more and more in demand. A cameo spot in the tasteless teen comedy American Pie saw them basically playing themselves, watching a shy hormonal male attempting to seduce a visiting foreign student live via an internet camera. Tom and Mark also found themselves playing wholesome 60s teen heroes Jan and Dean for the TV miniseries The History of Rock and Roll, doing a version of their classic 1964 hit Dead Man's Curve. The pair looked surprisingly similar to the teen idols, despite being almost the total opposite of them in real life. With Enema of the State still climbing, Blink-182 joined the newly expanded Vans Warped Tour. Sponsorship had been good to the Warped organisers. The 1999 tour now featured metal and hip-hop acts, as well as the obligatory punk complement. Each of the different genres was represented by a top-level act, like The Offspring, Ice-T, or Suicidal Tendencies. Every show was a miniature festival, with the schedule organised so that only one band was playing at any given time, and the major bands took it in turn to occupy the main slot. Blink-182 were well received every night, and some critics suggested their shows were the best of the whole tour. Mark and Tom found themselves in the spotlight once again because of their outspoken views. Having featured noted porn star Janine on the cover of their album, the band were often asked their opinions of the porn industry and pornography in general. Along with Fred Durst of Limp Bizkit, they were spotted several times attending parties hosted by various porn moguls. Happy to talk about their love of porn, Mark and Tom were once again held up as the naughty schoolboys of the rock scene. But that was okay. They had everything they wanted, and nothing was going to bring them down.
I think it will definitely progress as a band. I don't think that you can record record after record and still do the exact same thing. But it'll always be in the same vein. It'll always be like fast, sing-along, whatever songs. And but I just think that as we play, we're getting better as musicians, and we're getting better as songwriters and lyricists.
Blink-182 received a number of honours for their latest album. The Blockbuster Award saw them pick up the Favourite New Artist group, with the Backstreet Boys, Ricky Martin and Kid Rock also picking up awards. Enema of the State was voted 10th Best Album of the Year in the Wall of Sound Reader's Top 25 Albums of 1999. Surprisingly, they finished up ahead of several acts that might have been expected to beat them. Korn, Britney Spears and Eminem all scored lower than Blink-182. By entering the top 10, they were in the company of long-standing favourites such as 9 Inch Nails and the Red Hot Chili Peppers. The year 2000 would turn out to be the band's best year so far. The second single from the album was All the Small Things, released in February. It was an instant hit. Almost every radio station in the United States added it to their playlist, and MTV began playing the video several times a day. The video again featured a certain amount of nakedness from the band, but a good deal of humour too. The Backstreet Boys, Britney Spears and Christina Aguilera all found themselves being parodied by the band, who gratuitously ripped off their videos. Tom was featured wearing a blonde wig and a skimpy bikini, running along a beach and playing with a puppy, which eventually dragged him to the ground and attacked him. Another clip saw Mark rolling around in some flowers, as in the video Genie in a Bottle, except that Mark proceeded to eat the flowers. Music video channels took great pleasure in playing All the Small Things, next to the Backstreet Boys video. Whereas the fans in the boy band video held placards saying "We love you," Blink-182's fan held signs saying "Travis, I'm pregnant." Unsurprisingly, the Backstreet Boys were unavailable for comment. All the Small Things was the band's breakthrough hit. Enema of the State quickly headed towards the top of the album charts, despite having stayed in the lower reaches for some months. Suddenly, things were really happening for Blink-182. They featured on the cover of Rolling Stone and numerous other magazines, and they were invited to appear on many TV shows. MTV Europe featured their song choices for an entire hour, during which time they lived up to their reputation, flirting shamelessly with the young presenter and making jokes about Ricky Martin. Even though their album had been released the previous year, Blink-182 were the most exciting band of the year 2000. Bigger things were predicted for the summer. The early months of 2000 were taken up with the Big Day Out tour. The annual rock package took in the United States, Europe and Australia, although it failed to reach the UK. The headlining spot was rotated between the Red Hot Chili Peppers, 9 Inch Nails and the Foo Fighters, with Blink-182 being given the slot before the headliners. By the end of the tour, they had been seen by some 500,000 people. In May, the band took to the road for another tour of the United States, with 28 dates planned, including one show in Toronto, Canada. Support came from veteran Californian punks Bad Religion, a formative influence on almost every 90s punk act, and New Boy's Phoenix, Texas, who counted Blink-182 as one of their main inspirations. Further shows were to be added, with the band expecting to be touring the world again by the middle of July. In August, they would play their first major gig in the United Kingdom, being booked to appear at the Reading Leeds Festival in the company of Somerset pop punks A, Rage Against the Machine and Placebo. There are plans for a new album in late 2000, although whether this happens remains to be seen. Blink-182 are still riding on the back of Enema of the State, and the wave shows no sign of slowing down. The band are already being called the punk phenomenon of the millennium, and they're now firmly fixed in the Punk Rock Hall of Fame alongside contemporaries like The Offspring. With every other teenager hailing Blink-182 as their heroes, it won't be long before they have the world at their feet.